I once thought betrayal was just a matter of the heart, disguised as a nameless temp in my husband's headquarters. I never expected a sip of water to spark a purge. When his secretary slapped me before hundreds of eyes, screaming about her husband's bottle, I knew they wanted my family's legacy. Julian and Sloane have no idea the woman in this cheap shirt will let them climb high, only to orchestrate their public fall. My name is Harper Rodriguez. I am 37 years old, and I am a ghost haunting my own empire. To understand the gravity of the betrayal, you must first understand the kingdom that was stolen. I am the sole daughter of Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose name is etched into the bedrock of Austin, Texas. She was the visionary founder of Aurelian Grid Systems. We did not just sell software, we built the future. We engineered the energy infrastructure that powered entire municipalities and designed the complex fleet management software that kept thousands of electric commercial vehicles moving across the state. It was a massive, living organism of a company, built from the ground up by a mother who possessed a ruthless brilliance I always admired, even if I did not entirely share her appetite for corporate warfare. I had a mind for the long-term chessboard, the 10-year strategic horizon, but I detested the daily knife fights, the boardroom posturing, and the endless political maneuvering. When a sudden, massive stroke took my mother from me, it felt as though the gravity in my world had been permanently switched off. The grief was a physical weight, pinning me to the floor of her empty executive office. Unable to face the vultures circling the boardroom, I made a choice that I would come to regret with every fiber of my being. I stepped back from the daily operations. I secured my grip on the company through the ironclad family trust and maintained the vast majority of the voting shares, letting the day-to-day machinery run without my physical presence. I became a distant shadow, a signature on a quarterly proxy, trusting that the structure my mother built was strong enough to stand without her. Into that gaping void stepped Julian Mercer, my husband. At the time of my mother's passing, he was our chief operating officer. Julian was an entirely self-made entity, a man forged in a working-class background who spoke with a smooth, hypnotic cadence that could disarm a room full of hostile shareholders in exactly 5 minutes. He possessed a raw, magnetic charisma that pulled people into his orbit. More importantly, he knew exactly how to comfort a woman whose world had just collapsed. He held me through the darkest nights, promising that he would shoulder the burden of the company so I could simply breathe. The Texas business press adored us. They wrote glowing multi-page profiles calling us the perfect modern corporate marriage, the calm, aristocratic heiress and the fierce, relentless executive. I believed their narrative. I genuinely believed I had chosen the perfect partner to guard the legacy my mother had literally worked herself to death to build. I handed him the keys to the kingdom, trusting him implicitly to keep the gates locked and the wolves at bay. It took exactly 2 years for the polished veneer to crack and the rust to show. The changes were microscopic at first, the kind of subtle shifts you desperately wave away as the unavoidable stress of being at the top of a Fortune 500 company. But then the business trips grew longer, stretching from a standard 3 days to a full week, sometimes 10 days at a time. The grand house we shared grew colder, echoing with his absence. When he was home, he would walk through our front door and look right through me, carrying a rigid, vibrating tension in his jaw. If I ever brought up the quarterly projections over dinner, or asked a casual question about the company's sudden drop in liquidity, his legendary charm would instantly evaporate. It was replaced by a biting, defensive irritability. He would pour a glass of scotch and tell me I was out of touch, that the market was highly volatile, that the supply chain was a nightmare, and that I should just trust his stewardship. But I am my mother's daughter. I do not trust blind faith. The monthly financial summaries sent directly to the family trust began to look wrong. There were jagged edges in the accounting, tiny discrepancies that a passive investor would gloss over, but to someone who grew up reading balance sheets instead of fairy tales, they were glaring red sirens. Let me be entirely clear. It was not the faint, lingering scent of a cheap, unfamiliar floral perfume on his dry-cleaned shirts that kept me awake at 3 in the morning. Infidelity is painfully cliché. It is a weakness of the flesh, a pathetic betrayal of the vows, but it is ultimately a small domestic tragedy. What turned my blood to absolute ice were the corporate ledgers. Sitting alone in my home office, illuminated only by the glow of my monitor, I started noticing massive outbound payments to newly incorporated, entirely obscure vendors. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were quietly bleeding out of Aurelian's operational budget, attached to urgent procurement files that were glaringly missing the standard compliance signatures. The internal checks and balances my mother had painstakingly installed were being bypassed. Julian was not just cheating on his wife, he was systematically bleeding our company dry. Most women in my position, armed with a platinum credit card and a sense of righteous fury, would have immediately hired an expensive private investigator. A man with a long telephoto lens sitting in a dark sedan, waiting to snap high-resolution photos of my husband sneaking into a boutique downtown hotel with his mistress. I could have had him served with divorce papers over breakfast, leveraging the brutal infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement to leave him with nothing. But that would only excise the tumor at the surface. It would never show me the deeper rot. It would never show me exactly how Julian was dismantling Aurelian grid systems from the inside out, or who else in the executive suite was helping him hold the knife. I needed to see the raw paperwork. I needed to see the quiet, illicit handshakes happening on the operations floor, far away from the polished mahogany of the boardroom. I made a quiet, encrypted phone call to an old, fiercely loyal contact at a partner staffing agency. I called in a favor that had been owed to my family for over 15 years. 2 weeks later, Harper Rodriguez ceased to exist within the lower operational levels of the Aurelian building. In her place was Holly Reed. I walked into my own corporate headquarters wearing a cheap, off-the-rack polyester blouse that scratched at my skin, sensible rubber-soled flats, and heavy-framed glasses that deliberately dulled my features. I pulled my hair back into a severe, unflattering style. I was officially hired as a temporary contract records clerk in the operations support division, making $22 an hour. I was the absolute lowest rung on the corporate ladder, a disposable asset tasked with scanning purchase vouchers and filing hard copies in the windowless basement archives. I became completely invisible. And as I quickly learned, invisibility is the single greatest weapon a betrayed woman can wield. Sitting in a cramped, gray cubicle that smelled of stale breakroom coffee and ozone from the constantly jamming copy machine, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to my mother's memory. I would not let raw emotion dictate my timeline. I would not confront him in a screaming match in our foyer, breaking plates and demanding answers he would only lie about. I would walk the halls of this company as an absolute nobody. I would watch the cash flow like a hawk watching a field. I would document every lie, every forged signature, every stolen dollar. I would smile politely at the arrogant executives who passed me in the corridors, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were walking past the majority shareholder who held their careers in the palm of her hand. I would observe the entire board, study the entire game board, and when the moment was perfectly aligned, I would strike. I will only swing the blade when I am absolutely certain it will hit the vital nerve. Julian thinks the heiress is asleep in her grief. He has absolutely no idea she is already inside the walls, holding the matches, ready to burn his false kingdom to the ground. My very first morning on the operational floor hit me with the stench of a rotting culture. The Aurelian grid systems I knew, the one my mother built, was designed for brutal efficiency but undeniable respect. Walking out of the elevator onto floor 4, I was greeted by a labyrinth of compressed, suffocating cubicles. They had clearly crammed 20% more desks into the same square footage since my last visit. The air was stale, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a cheap, headache-inducing hum, and the coffee in the break room tasted like scorched earth. Cost-cutting was glaringly obvious here at the bottom. The corporate memo had likely championed lean agility, but the reality was just plain cheap. Yet, the moment you took the private elevator up to floor 42, the executive level, the austerity vanished. I had to deliver a stack of hard copy vendor agreements up there by 11 o'clock. The doors opened to vast expanses of imported Italian marble, custom acoustic paneling that swallowed all noise, and museum-grade lighting. It was disgusting. It was the desperate, ostentatious flexing of a leadership team trying to project power rather than actually creating market value. They were starving the engine to polish the hood. Down in the trenches of the records department, the veteran employees moved like beaten dogs. Women and men who had been with the company for 10 or 15 years spoke in hushed, clipped tones whenever the executive suite was mentioned. There was a palpable climate of anxiety. I sat in my gray box, alphabetizing and scanning, listening to the murmurs over the low wall of my cubicle. Everyone knew there was an inner circle, a protected ring of favorites orbiting Julian. Nobody dared to map it out loud, but the fear of crossing that invisible line dictated every interaction. My assigned tasks as Holly Reed were mind-numbingly clerical, which was exactly what I needed. I spent 8 hours a day cross-referencing procurement files, digitizing lithium battery transport contracts, and sorting travel advance vouchers. The sheer volume of paper was a perfect smokescreen for a forensic audit. It did not take a seasoned auditor to see the gaping, deliberate holes in the system. I noticed a distinct pattern by day 3. Invoices from our new logistics partners were systematically split into smaller increments. An invoice for $85,000 would be broken into 2 separate invoices of $42,500. Why? Because the compliance threshold for mandatory board review was exactly $50,000. Someone was deliberately keeping these massive cash bleeds just under the radar. Furthermore, urgent shipping contracts for hazardous materials were bypassing the standard 2-week environmental safety review. They were just rubber-stamped with a priority override sticker and pushed through the system. The infrastructure was crumbling from the inside, eaten away by greed. Amidst the sea of forged approvals and split invoices, one name kept floating to the surface of the office gossip like a toxic spill: Sloane Whitaker. On paper, her title was Executive Support Clerk. In reality, she paraded through the building like the co-founder. I watched a senior logistics manager, a man who oversaw a budget of $12 million, physically stand up and rush to hold the elevator door for her, offering to fetch her an iced oat milk latte from the cafe across the street. When she entered the lobby in the mornings, the security desk did not make her swipe her badge. They manually opened the VIP turnstile with a fawning smile. She was untouchable, wrapped in an invisible cloak of absolute immunity. I finally saw her up close on a Tuesday afternoon. I was tasked with dropping off a misrouted expense report to the executive assistant pool. As I rounded the corner of the mahogany-paneled hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sloane was stepping out of Julian's private office. She did not just walk out. She lingered in the doorway. She reached up with a familiarity that made my stomach turn, resting her hand flat against his chest, her fingers delicately adjusting the knot of his silk tie. It was an intimate, possessive gesture, executed in the middle of a glass-walled corporate corridor. Julian did not flinch. He leaned into it, offering her a low, private smile before turning back to his desk. She turned and walked down the hall, the sharp clack of her designer heels echoing against the marble, completely oblivious to the temp worker standing 30 feet away holding a manila folder. Later that same afternoon, I was asked to restock the premium sparkling water in the executive pantry. It was a secluded, high-end kitchenette reserved strictly for vice presidents and above. As I arranged the glass bottles in the refrigerator, my eyes caught something sitting on the granite countertop next to the espresso machine. It was a matte black, heavy-duty thermos. I stopped breathing. I knew the exact weight of that thermos. I knew the slight texture of the powder coating. I had custom ordered it from a metalworker in Portland for our first wedding anniversary. It was designed to keep coffee scalding hot for 24 hours, a nod to Julian's brutal travel schedule back when he was actually working to build the company, not drain it. But what made it unique was the inside of the brushed steel lid. I had asked the artisan to engrave a private, highly specific phrase inside that lid, 7 words that only Julian and I knew. A secret vow from a wife to her husband. A cold, sharp shiver ran violently down my spine. It was not the burning, chaotic heat of a jealous wife. It was the icy realization of a profound violation. That thermos belonged on the nightstand of our master bedroom, or in the cup holder of his personal car. It was a sacred, private artifact of our marriage. Seeing it sitting here, left carelessly on a communal counter in the executive suite, felt like finding the lock to my front door picked and thrown in the street. It was a trophy. She had brought it here to mark her territory. The boundary between my private home and my ruined company had been entirely obliterated. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during my 30-minute unpaid lunch break. The Aurelian cafeteria was heavily segregated by an invisible caste system. The contract workers and lower-level staff crammed into the plastic booths near the microwaves, while the management types occupied the sunlit tables near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in a dark corner, mechanically chewing a dry turkey sandwich, blending into the background noise. A group of marketing coordinators sat at the table next to mine, speaking in hushed, breathless tones. They were dissecting a meeting that had happened that morning. I kept my eyes glued to my phone, listening intently. "Did you hear what she said during the vendor call?" one of them whispered, taking a sip of her diet soda. "Sloane?" another replied, leaning in. "Yes, I nearly choked." Julian asked for the updated timelines, and she literally touched his arm and said not to worry, because her husband would have them signed by 5 o'clock. The table erupted in low, conspiratorial giggles. "It is their running inside joke," a third woman chimed in, sounding almost envious. "She calls him her hubby all the time when the doors are closed. Even the vice presidents just laugh along. It is like they are the actual power couple of the building." I stopped chewing. I placed my half-eaten sandwich back into its plastic container. My husband. She was parading around my company, spending my family's money, wearing my husband on her arm, and calling him her own, right in front of the very employees whose livelihoods depended on the stability of this corporation. And the management team was not just turning a blind eye. They were enabling it. They were bowing to the mistress because they knew the mistress controlled the king. The anger that washed over me was no longer a storm. It was a perfectly still, frozen lake. I had seen enough forged documents. I had gathered enough split invoices. I had witnessed the arrogant, unchecked rot spreading through the veins of my mother's legacy. I did not need to spend another month lurking in the shadows, waiting for a massive structural collapse. These people were entirely too comfortable. They were intoxicated by their own perceived invincibility. I realized then that I did not need a complex, months-long legal strategy to expose the first layer of this infection. I just needed to strike at their arrogance. I needed one precise, highly visible action. A single spark dropped directly into the center of their delusional, self-important theater. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I knew exactly where to do it. The time for silent observation was over. Tomorrow, the ghost was going to make herself known. The Aurelian dining hall at 1 p.m. was a brutal, glass-enclosed microcosm of the caste system Julian had meticulously cultivated over the past 2 years. It was physically divided by a waist-high partition of frosted glass and decorative bamboo, but it might as well have been a towering concrete wall topped with electrified wire. On the northern side, the contract workers, the junior analysts, and the warehouse support staff fought for elbow room at long, sticky laminate tables. The air over there was heavy, smelling of microwaved leftover pasta, cheap artificial cheese, and the quiet desperation of people making $20 an hour. On the southern side, bathed in natural sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows, lay the executive enclave. It featured plush, curved leather booths, private tables crafted from reclaimed cedar, and an exclusive catered buffet that smelled of seared ahi tuna, roasted asparagus, and truffle oil. It was a daily, visceral reminder broadcast to the entire building, dictating exactly who possessed worth and who was entirely disposable. Sloane was holding court in the absolute center of that executive section, perched like an uncrowned queen. She sat perfectly upright in the largest corner booth, flanked by 3 mid-level directors who were leaning in, laughing entirely too hard at whatever mundane story she was telling. One was the head of regional marketing, another the director of fleet logistics. Men who managed budgets of $15 million were acting like eager schoolboys desperate for a nod of approval. She wore a tailored white sheath dress that likely cost more than my entire monthly temp salary, but my eyes did not linger on her clothes or her audience. My gaze locked immediately onto the center of her cedar table. There, sitting proudly next to a plate of untouched artisan greens, was the matte black thermos. It was positioned perfectly in the middle, standing like a dark monolith, an arrogant monument to her assumed conquest of my life. I picked up my faded plastic tray. It held a watery cup of institutional chicken noodle soup and a prepackaged limp salad wrapped in condensation-covered cellophane. My hands were perfectly steady. My heart rate was slow and rhythmic. I stepped away from the crowded laminate tables. I walked directly past the frosted glass partition. I felt the collective shift in the atmosphere instantly. Hundreds of conversations died within 3 seconds as people registered a temp worker in a drab gray cardigan deliberately crossing the invisible boundary into the restricted zone. I ignored the panicked look of a junior human resources associate who half stood to intercept me, her mouth opening to issue a warning she never managed to voice. I approached Sloane's table. The 3 directors stopped laughing abruptly, their faces pulling into expressions of profound, offended confusion. Sloane looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I set my cheap plastic tray down on the empty edge of her expensive cedar table. The jarring clatter of hard plastic against solid wood echoed sharply across the quiet enclave. Before anyone could draw a breath to reprimand me, before the logistics director could bark an order for security, I reached out. I wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy steel of the black thermos. I lifted it. The weight was intimately familiar. The room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. I could hear the faint hum of the industrial refrigerator 50 feet away. Every single eye in the cafeteria was locked on my hands. I slowly unscrewed the cap, the metal grinding softly against metal. I tilted the lid slightly toward the overhead fluorescent lights. There they were, the 7 custom-engraved words staring back at me. I lifted the rim to my mouth and took a long, slow, deliberate sip of the ice-cold water. I swallowed. I did not rush. I stood there, holding her stolen trophy, tasting the water, testing exactly how deep the silence in this room could go. The explosion was instantaneous and violent. Sloane let out a sharp, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated outrage. She sprang from the leather booth with terrifying speed, knocking her own chair backward. Her arm swung out in a wide arc, violently slapping my plastic tray off the table. The bowl of soup shattered against the polished concrete floor, sending a wide spray of lukewarm yellow broth, noodles, and plastic shards across the expensive leather shoes of the paralyzed marketing director. But she did not stop at the destruction of my lunch. Using the momentum of her entire body, she pivoted and struck me across the left side of my face. The slap was a violent, open-handed crack that snapped my head to the side. It sounded exactly like a gunshot echoing through the cavernous, dead-silent room. My heavy-framed glasses flew off my face, skittering uselessly across the wet floor. A sharp metallic taste immediately flooded my mouth where my teeth had cut into my inner cheek. A brilliant flash of white light exploded behind my eyelids, followed by a radiating, burning heat spreading from my jaw up to my temple. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not stumble backward. I did not flinch. Sloane was vibrating with uncontrollable fury. Her face flushed a dark, angry red. The polished mask of the untouchable corporate queen completely shattered into jagged pieces. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice tore through the cafeteria, shrill, arrogant, and entirely unhinged. "That is my hubby's. How dare you touch his things?" "You dare?" It was a spectacular, catastrophic failure of judgment. In her blind rage over a perceived slight from a disposable peasant, she had screamed the quiet part out loud. She had publicly laid claim to the chief executive officer in front of nearly 150 employees. The arrogance that Julian had allowed to fester had just detonated in his own building. I slowly turned my head back to look at the crowd. Not a single person moved to intervene. I saw at least 20 cell phones half raised in the air, camera lenses pointed directly at us, recording every second of the spectacle. Yet, everyone remained frozen behind their invisible barriers. They were terrified. They did not fear a secretary having a temper tantrum. They feared the massive, unseen network of corporate protection standing directly behind her. They knew that intervening meant going up against the woman who controlled the man who signed every single one of their paychecks. The silence was agonizingly heavy, thick with the anticipation of an execution. Then, the heavy glass double doors at the far eastern end of the cafeteria swung open violently. Julian strode in. His jaw was set in a tight, furious line. He had clearly been pulled from a high-level meeting, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened. He looked intensely annoyed that a petty operational squabble was interrupting his highly valuable time. He pushed his way roughly through the paralyzed crowd of onlookers, demanding a path. "What in the absolute hell is going on down here?" he barked, his voice carrying the deep, authoritative boom he reserved for unruly board members or failing contractors. He looked at the spilled food, the shattered plastic, and then at Sloane, who was still breathing heavily, a triumphant, expectant sneer beginning to form on her lips as she waited for her protector to obliterate the temp worker. Then, Julian turned his head and looked at the victim. He looked at the mousy, poorly dressed contract worker standing silently amidst the wreckage of the cafeteria floor. Our eyes locked. I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed the visual information. I watched the arrogant annoyance evaporate from his handsome face, replaced instantly by a pale, visceral, hollow terror. His broad shoulders visibly collapsed inward. He stopped breathing entirely. The blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse dressed in a $5,000 Italian suit. He looked exactly like a man who had just realized the solid ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was actually a painted canvas stretched over a bottomless, terrifying abyss. The powerful chief executive officer was suddenly just a terrified little boy staring at a ghost. I raised my right hand, moving with agonizing slowness. I brought my thumb to the corner of my mouth and wiped away the thick bead of warm blood that had pooled on my lower lip. I looked down at the bright red smear on my skin for a brief second, acknowledging the physical assault. Then, I slowly raised my eyes back to my husband. I did not shout. I did not demand an explanation or an apology. I did not shed a single tear or break my rigid composure to reveal the betrayed, heartbroken wife buried underneath the cheap gray cardigan. I offered him nothing but an absolute, dead, unblinking stare. I let the horrific reality of the situation wrap its cold hands around his throat and squeeze. I let him stand there, suffocating in the deafening silence of 150 witnesses, realizing that the insignificant woman he thought he had completely discarded was standing right in front of him, covered in his mistress's violence, holding the match that would burn his entire life to ash. I did not wait for the paralysis in that cafeteria to break. The moment Julian took a step toward me, his hand reaching out in a desperate, panicked reflex, I turned on my heel and walked away. I heard him call out a name, his voice a strangled, pathetic rasp that barely carried over the spilled soup, but I did not stop, nor did I look back. He wanted to drag me into a secluded corner office, to shut the blinds, to spin a frantic web of damage control and manipulate the narrative before the adrenaline faded. I refused to give him that ground. In any hostile engagement, controlling the tempo of the fallout is your greatest tactical advantage. He was drowning in chaos. I was already moving to the next phase. I walked straight out of the building, got into my car, and drove 3 miles to a private, high-end urgent care clinic in a quiet suburban medical park. I did not go to a crowded emergency room where details get lost in the shuffle. I needed precision. I sat on the sterile examination paper and calmly instructed the attending physician to take high-resolution, brightly lit photographs of my face. The left side of my jaw was already blooming into a mottled, angry purple, and the cut inside my cheek required a minor topical treatment. I ensured the medical chart clearly documented the exact time of the examination, the current date, and a stark, unembellished description of the cause of injury. An unprovoked physical assault by a colleague in a corporate workplace. It was a completely detached surgical procedure. I was not a crying victim seeking comfort. I was a plaintiff establishing a pristine chain of custody for a future civil and criminal filing. At 7 o'clock that evening, I was sitting at the dark mahogany dining table in my hotel suite, a legal pad perfectly aligned in front of me, when my burner phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. It was Denise Holloway. She was the senior payroll manager, a quiet, fiercely diligent woman who had been with Aurelian Grid Systems for over 15 years. My mother had hired her. Denise spoke in a rushed, terrified whisper, clearly calling from her car. She told me that she had seen what happened, that the entire building was vibrating with the fallout, and she urged Holly Reed to simply resign immediately, pack her bags, and disappear. She warned me that people who crossed the executive suite did not just get fired. Their professional reputations in the Texas energy sector were quietly, systematically destroyed. I let her speak, absorbing the raw fear in her voice. Then, I lowered my tone to a calm, authoritative cadence that Holly Reed would never possess. I told Denise that I appreciated her loyalty to the company, that I was entirely safe, and that this specific incident was not going to be buried like the others. I did not reveal my true identity over an unsecured line, but I used a specific, operational phrase regarding the old payroll software integration. Something only a founding family member would casually know. I heard Denise sharply inhale on the other end. The fear in her voice shifted into a stunned, breathless realization. With that newly established trust, Denise opened the vault. She confessed that Sloane had a heavily documented history of violently berating junior staff. There had been at least 4 formal, written human resources complaints filed against her in the past 8 months. Yet, every single time a grievance was elevated to the executive floor, the digital file mysteriously vanished from the server, and the complaining employee was quietly reassigned or terminated for fabricated performance issues. I ended the call and immediately dialed the managing partner of the external staffing agency that had placed my alias. I did not make a request. I issued a legal directive. I demanded that my original employment contract, my daily time logs, and every single email coordinating my shifts be immediately exported and transmitted directly to the private, encrypted server of my personal attorney. I knew exactly how Julian's mind worked. By tomorrow morning, his panicked IT directors would attempt to scrub Holly Reed from the Aurelian mainframe, erasing my badge swipes and login credentials to pretend the temp worker had never existed. I locked my digital footprint in a vault before they even realized they needed to delete it. But the most chilling revelation of the day did not come from the office. It came from my own home. While I was securing my employment records, I made a quiet call to Maria, my head housekeeper who had managed our private estate for 2 decades. I asked her to discreetly enter my personal, locked study on the 2nd floor and check the vintage cherry wood filing cabinet behind my desk. 10 minutes later, Maria called me back. Her voice was shaking. She told me that the brass physical lock on the cabinet had been entirely replaced with a new digital keypad. I asked her to check the spare key box in the pantry. The emergency override key was gone. Someone had surgically invaded my private sanctuary. I knew exactly what was kept in the 2nd drawer of that specific cabinet. It held the original, watermarked physical copies of the family trust's voting share proxy mechanisms. The documents that legally dictated who controlled the majority power of Aurelian Grid Systems in the event of my incapacitation or absence, at roughly 9:30 in the evening, my hotel room door unlocked. Julian stepped inside. He had used our joint credit card history to track my location. He looked exhausted, his tie discarded, his hair deliberately rumpled to project a carefully manufactured aura of vulnerability. He possessed a master's degree in reading a room, and he immediately tried to deploy a practiced, sorrowful face. He sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa, letting out a long, theatrical sigh. He began weaving a pathetic, minimizing narrative. He claimed that Sloane was just a highly stressed, overzealous assistant who had developed an unhealthy, one-sided attachment to him. He called the assault a minor, hysterical overreaction. He looked at me with those deep, pleading eyes and begged me not to make a massive, public mess of the company over a small, personal misunderstanding. He swore he would fire her quietly the next day, frame it as a mutual separation, and we could go back to counseling. His rush to mitigate the damage was incredibly sloppy. He was speaking far too fast, glossing over the fact that his mistress had physically assaulted his wife in front of 100 people. Entirely focused on keeping the company machinery running without a formal investigation. I sat across from him, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My phone was resting face down on the glass coffee table between us. The voice memo application was actively running, recording every single desperate, lying syllable. Texas is a one-party consent state for audio recordings, a legal fact Julian had apparently forgotten in his panic. I nodded slowly, offering him nothing but silence, letting him dig the hole deeper. I watched his lips move, but I was no longer looking at a cheating husband. I was looking at a corporate thief. The swapped lock on my filing cabinet, the missing proxy documents, the terrified payroll manager, the deleted human resources files, and now this desperate gaslighting performance. The pieces snapped together with a sickening, crystalline clarity. The infidelity was just a cheap, dirty distraction. It was the shallow surface dust covering a massive, structural crime. Julian was not just sleeping with his secretary. He was using her to consolidate power while he actively rewrote the foundational control of my mother's empire. He was orchestrating a hostile, completely illegal takeover of Aurelian grid systems, and he thought I was too broken by grief to notice him stealing the throne right out from under me. He thought he was managing a hysterical wife. He had absolutely no idea he was giving a sworn, recorded deposition to his own executioner. I needed a legal mind, someone who knew the intricate architecture of my mother's empire just as intimately as I did. I reached out to Malcolm Vale. Malcolm was the former internal general counsel for Aurelian Grid Systems, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Elena Rodriguez for 25 years before taking his well-deserved retirement. He was a silver-haired legal shark who wore bespoke tweed suits and possessed a mind like a steel trap. More importantly, he remained the absolute, unshakable guardian of our family trust. He was the only person on this earth I trusted with the sheer magnitude of what I was about to expose. We met in the heavily wood-paneled study of his private residence on the quiet outskirts of the city, far away from the prying eyes of the downtown corporate district. I laid my secure tablet on his grand mahogany desk and unlocked the encrypted folder containing the hundreds of photographs I had taken during my time masquerading as a lowly clerk. Over the next 48 hours, Malcolm ran a ruthless forensic comb through the fragmented procurement records, the bypassed compliance forms, and the monthly financial summaries. What he found was not a mere leak in the company finances, it was a severed artery. He isolated a distinct cluster of newly minted logistics and technical consulting firms that had suddenly appeared on the vendor payroll over the past 8 months. On paper, these entities were barely capitalized. They possessed minimal operational assets, generic placeholder websites, and practically zero industry history. Yet, Aurelian Grid Systems was bleeding massive, entirely uncharacteristic upfront payments to them. We were looking at initial disbursements of $300,000, sometimes up to $500,000, released into the ether before a single hour of service was rendered or a single piece of equipment was delivered. The true horror emerged when Malcolm bypassed the standard operational software and dug deeply into the state incorporation filings. The registered legal agents for these obscure shell companies were not random corporate lawyers. Through 2 dense, deliberately convoluted layers of holding entities, the ownership structure traced back directly to the extended family members of Sloane Whitaker. It was a brilliantly insulated scheme, carefully avoiding the clumsy mistake of putting her own brother or father on the primary deed. But the paper trail was undeniably there for anyone who knew exactly where to look. It was a massive, highly prosecutable conflict of interest. She and Julian were using the company's critical operations budget as their own private, limitless slush fund. But embezzling operational cash was ultimately a small-time grift. Julian possessed an ego far too large for mere theft. He was aiming for a permanent coronation. Malcolm and I quickly realized that the entire financial manipulation was tethered to a single, monumental event looming on the immediate horizon: the Sunridge Civic Transit Authority contract. Sunridge was a massive interregional urban transit agency preparing to completely electrify their entire fleet of commercial passenger buses. It was a multi-year, 9-figure government contract that had the entire energy infrastructure sector holding its breath. Securing the Sunridge deal would instantly inflate Aurelian's market valuation by at least 40%. It would solidify Julian's position with the board of directors, cementing his public image as a visionary titan who had successfully guided the company out of the shadow of its deceased founder. However, to win a government bid of that staggering magnitude, the technical specifications of our energy grids and our proprietary battery dispatch software had to be absolutely flawless. Late that evening, my encrypted email inbox pinged softly in the quiet study. It was a forwarded message from Denise. She had bravely leveraged her deep, long-standing roots in the company to reach out to a former senior testing engineer, a man who had been quietly forced into an early, highly discouraged retirement 3 months prior. He had sent Denise a heavily redacted, original diagnostic report regarding our latest high-capacity thermal battery modules, the exact modules slated for the Sunridge bus fleet. The original, unaltered data showed a catastrophic failure rate. Under peak simulated summer transit conditions, operating under heavy passenger loads, the core battery modules were consistently overheating. They were pushing dangerously past critical thermal thresholds, exhibiting early signs of thermal runaway, a condition that leads directly to unstoppable lithium-ion combustion. The subsequent report that was ultimately presented to the executive suite, and the one submitted to the Sunridge Procurement Committee to secure the bid, had been surgically altered. The failure rates were entirely erased. They were replaced with fabricated, perfectly compliant performance metrics. The realization hit me with the paralyzing force of a physical blow. Julian was not just stealing my money to fund his mistress's lifestyle. He was actively gambling with public safety. If those batteries failed on a packed commuter bus in the middle of a blazing August afternoon, the catastrophic physical risk would fall squarely on thousands of innocent passengers. The resulting federal investigations and inevitable lawsuits would completely vaporize my mother's legacy, leaving Aurelian in ashes. Julian was willing to risk human lives just to lock in a deal that would secure his absolute power. I thought the depth of his depravity had finally bottomed out, but Malcolm had one final, devastating card to play. He turned his heavy laptop monitor toward me, his face grim and deeply lined with anger. He had pulled up a highly classified draft document from the deepest, most restricted archives of the family trust's digital vault. It was a drafted, legally binding amendment to the voting proxy authorization. It explicitly transferred irrevocable, long-term voting control of my majority shares directly to Julian Mercer. It effectively stripped me of all my power, turning me into a voiceless, passive beneficiary in my own company. And at the bottom of the final page, stark and undeniable against the glowing white screen, was my secure electronic signature. I stared at the screen, the blood draining from my face, my entire body turning to Freon. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never authorized a transfer of power. I looked closely at the digital timestamp of the certified signature. It was dated the 14th of November of the previous year. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking with a terrifying, cold clarity, and opened my travel calendar. On the morning of the 14th of November, I was sitting in a crowded, brightly lit auditorium in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was delivering a keynote address at a prominent philanthropic summit dedicated to renewable energy access. I possessed airline boarding passes, hotel receipts, credit card charges, and roughly 500 industry witnesses who could definitively place me 2 states away at the exact minute that signature was magically generated on the corporate server back in Austin. The parameters of the war had fundamentally and irreversibly shifted. This was no longer a painful domestic dispute about a straying husband and an overly ambitious secretary. It was a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. They were building a fraudulent, gilded empire using forged legal documents, faked engineering safety data, and a massive public infrastructure contract to completely legitimize the theft of my entire life. They believed they had outsmarted the grieving heiress. They thought they had successfully buried me alive beneath mountains of fabricated paperwork. They had absolutely no idea that I was already holding the shovel, and I was preparing to bury them under the crushing weight of their own monumental hubris. The corporate machine responded exactly as I anticipated. Julian did not succumb to a public meltdown, nor did he issue a frantic company-wide apology. He was, above all else, a masterful strategist when backed into a corner, relying on the very playbook that had elevated him to his current status. By 9 o'clock the following morning, a meticulously crafted narrative was already circulating through the sterile hallways of the headquarters. The Whisper campaign, seated carefully through his loyal mid-level managers, suggested that a disgruntled, mentally unstable temporary contractor had deliberately provoked a senior executive assistant in a desperate, pathetic attempt to manufacture a workplace harassment scandal for a quick financial settlement. It was textbook corporate assassination, designed to immediately discredit the victim before she could even file a formal grievance. Simultaneously, the Human Resources Department initiated a total digital purge. My building access badge was abruptly deactivated. The temporary email alias assigned to my undercover persona was wiped from the Exchange server. Every single digital footprint of my presence was being systematically incinerated. Julian genuinely believed that by erasing my alias from the internal network, he was neutralizing the threat. He assumed I was a naive interloper. He had absolutely no idea that I had already secured the master copies of my employment contracts, the encrypted daily time logs, and all internal correspondence through the external staffing agency's independent servers long before his IT directors even began their frantic sweep. His desperate attempt to rewrite history was entirely futile, but it confirmed the profound panic festering behind his polished facade. I refused to remain in the sprawling estate we had shared for the past 7 years. The massive house had devolved into a chilling, echoing gallery of a dead marriage, filled with expensive modern art and an unbearable, suffocating silence. More importantly, it was a severe tactical vulnerability. Remaining under his roof meant allowing him to monitor my movements, intercept my incoming legal mail, or conveniently misplace my personal documents. I packed 2 discreet suitcases and relocated to a corner suite at a highly secure, luxury hotel in the downtown business district. The anonymity of the suite, with its heavy soundproof doors, sweeping views of the city skyline, and strictly controlled elevator access, provided the exact legal and physical sanctuary I required to orchestrate the next phase of the operation. The isolation of the hotel also provided a safe, unmonitored venue for my rapidly expanding network of internal dissidents. Later that afternoon, my trusted payroll contact arranged a clandestine meeting in the quiet, dimly lit lobby lounge of my hotel. She brought a man named Owen Pike. Owen was the regional warehouse manager for our largest suburban logistics hub. A gruff, exhausted veteran of the supply chain who looked as though he had not slept a full night in 3 weeks. He had recently protested a direct executive order to bypass standard safety inspection protocols for outbound battery shipments. In return for his professional integrity, he was explicitly threatened with a severe demotion and the immediate loss of his accumulated pension. Owen did not come to the hotel empty-handed. He sat rigidly in the plush velvet armchair and slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. Inside were dozens of high-resolution photographs of the physical inventory bays, revealing massive, undeniable shortages of high-grade lithium components. He paired these photographs with the corresponding outbound export manifests, proving definitively that the inventory reports being submitted to our regional partners were entirely fabricated. The highly volatile materials were being officially logged as fully inspected and safely shipped, when in reality, they were either missing entirely or being routed through unverified secondary channels to cut costs. It was concrete, undeniable proof of systemic operational fraud, neatly packaged by a working-class man who had simply had enough of the corruption. With those explosive documents legally secured in my attorney's private vault, I needed to close the final loop. I needed Julian to state his true intentions on the record, without the filter of his public relations team. That evening, I returned to the marital estate one last time under the guise of retrieving a collection of my mother's private journals. I knew Julian would be waiting. He was standing in the center of the grand foyer, holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive bourbon, bathed in the cold, blue light of the advanced security system. He immediately launched into a carefully rehearsed, heavily curated negotiation. He lowered his voice, adopting the smooth, practiced, deeply hypnotic tone he usually reserved for pacifying nervous institutional investors. He offered a hollow, incredibly patronizing apology for his mistress, dismissing her violent public outburst as the isolated actions of an overworked, highly emotional subordinate who had simply lost her temper. He casually blamed the entire cafeteria incident on a severe lack of discipline among the lower-level staff, deliberately minimizing the sheer audacity of the woman claiming his personal thermos as a romantic trophy. Then came the implicit demand. He stepped closer, the sharp scent of his expensive cologne thick and suffocating in the quiet foyer. He softly suggested that we keep this unfortunate misunderstanding entirely private. He insisted that I needed to remain silent, stay out of the corporate offices, and remain absolutely invisible until after the grand public announcement of the Sunridge Civic Transit Authority contract, which was scheduled to take place in exactly 4 days. He framed my silence as a necessary, temporary sacrifice for the greater good of the company, a brief truce to protect our shared generational wealth. I stood perfectly still, letting his manipulative, insulting monologue hang in the chilled air of the foyer. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single trace of the hysterical, heartbroken, easily manipulated wife he was so desperately expecting to manage. I simply looked him directly in the eyes and asked a highly specific question. I asked him about the forged electronic signature on the Family Trust Proxy Amendment, dated the 14th of November. I then casually inquired about the exact capitalization structure of the 3 new logistics vendors registered to the extended family members of his beloved executive assistant. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The gentle, apologetic mask completely dissolved, revealing the absolute, unyielding predator lurking beneath the tailored suit. The calculated warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, dead, reptilian stare. He took a predatory step forward, invading my physical space, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that echoed off the marble floors. He told me that I had been hiding in the pathetic shadows of my grief for far too long. He stated, with absolute, chilling conviction, that I fundamentally did not understand how the real world of aggressive corporate expansion functioned. He leaned in, his breath grazing my cheek, and sneered that my inherited voting shares were essentially meaningless pieces of paper if the entire executive machine, the board of directors, and the operational infrastructure were all standing firmly behind him. He was declaring himself the undisputed king of a stolen castle. I did not argue. I did not defend my mother's legacy or my own strategic intelligence. I simply asked him why the Sunridge contract was so overwhelmingly critical that he was entirely willing to bypass critical thermal safety regulations to secure it. His ego, dangerously inflated by 2 years of entirely unchecked power, simply could not resist the opportunity to boast to the woman he believed he had definitively conquered. He coldly explained that the Sunridge deal was his absolute, impenetrable shield. Once the ink was dry on that massive, multi-million-dollar government contract, his position as the undisputed visionary savior of Aurelian grid systems would be permanently locked. He arrogantly detailed how, Post-signing, any attempt I made to reclaim operational control would be easily spun by his public relations apparatus as the erratic, destructive behavior of a jealous, estranged wife trying to sabotage a monumental triumph out of pure, bitter spite. He was telling me, directly to my face, that he was going to use a fraudulent public infrastructure deal to completely legitimize his theft of my company, and that he would happily destroy my public reputation to accomplish it. I listened intently, my face a perfect, unreadable mask of stone, deep within the silk-lined pocket of my tailored wool coat. My mobile device was silently recording every single arrogant, deeply incriminating word. My legal counsel had explicitly prepared me for this exact, high-stakes confrontation, coaching me on the precise legal phrasing required to establish malicious intent and premeditated corporate fraud without violating the strict boundaries of a one-party consent state. Julian's monumental arrogance had just handed me the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle. I turned away from him without speaking another word. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of the estate, the crisp night air biting at my face, leaving him standing alone in the cold foyer. As I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, the heavy door thudding shut behind me, I realized that the woman who had entered that house earlier in the evening was completely dead. I was no longer a grieving daughter trying to salvage a shattered, abusive marriage. I was the majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar enterprise, launching a ruthless, perfectly calculated military campaign to take back my empire before the man I once loved could sell its soul to the highest bidder. The trap was fully constructed and baited. Now, I merely had to wait 4 days and let him walk proudly onto the stage. I made a deliberate, agonizing choice to remain entirely submerged in the shadows. Plunging a knife in the dark is only effective if the target has absolutely no idea you are holding the handle. Julian believed he was managing a domestic crisis, a temporary emotional flare-up from a grieving wife who had stumbled onto his infidelity. He had no conception of the massive, structural counter-offensive assembling beneath his feet. His profound ignorance of exactly how much I knew was the single most valuable asset in my entire arsenal. I would not squander it on a premature confrontation, to pull down a man who is pretending to be a king. You do not attack the throne directly. You methodically cut the power to the stage lights. I directed Malcolm to initiate contact with Ruth Maddox. Ruth was a veteran powerhouse on the board of directors, a brilliant, uncompromising woman who had been my mother's closest strategic ally for over 2 decades. Malcolm did not show her the full hand. A seasoned corporate attorney knows exactly how to bait a hook. He requested a highly confidential, off-the-record breakfast meeting at her private club. He told her just enough to ignite her sharp instincts, mentioning a severe, undocumented compliance irregularity regarding the upcoming municipal infrastructure contract. He secured her absolute guarantee that she would be physically present in the front row for the Sunridge public announcement ceremony. She would be our anchor in the boardroom when the hurricane made landfall. Inside the corporate walls, my invisible network was pulling vital files from the sinking ship. Denise bypassed the restricted human resources servers, quietly extracting the original, unredacted employee grievance letters regarding the hostile work environment, the very complaints the executive floor had systematically buried. From the suburban distribution center, Owen transmitted a fresh batch of digital manifests. This new data was catastrophic. It proved unequivocally that multiple high-value logistics shipments, which were officially certified as inspected and departed, had actually never left the loading docks. They were phantom shipments, pure paper fabrications designed to accelerate the fraudulent vendor payments we had discovered earlier. Then, a completely unexpected piece of leverage fell into our laps from the information technology department. A junior systems administrator, a quiet young man in his 20s, who had been on the receiving end of several humiliating reprimands from the executive suite, reached out to Denise through an encrypted messaging application. He revealed that a verbal directive had come down from the chief operating officer to permanently purge the security camera footage of the dining hall from the centralized servers. They wanted the slap erased from history. However, disgusted by the rampant abuse of authority, The young technician had secretly copied the raw, high-definition video file onto a heavily encrypted external drive a full hour before the deletion order was formally executed. The visceral, undeniable proof of the assault was now safely locked in my possession. While we were meticulously gathering ammunition, the opposition was growing dangerously careless. Sloane, intoxicated by her perceived victory and operating under the delusion that I was merely a jealous, powerless wife, began talking entirely too much to the wrong people. During a catered luncheon with the corporate communications team, an event where she positioned herself at the head of the table, she let her monumental hubris slip. A sympathetic marketing coordinator later relayed the exact quote to Denise. Sloane had casually taken a sip of champagne, smiled at the public relations director, and boasted that after the Sunridge deal was officially signed, everyone in the building would finally realize who actually ran the company. She was already measuring the drapes for the chief executive office, but the most crucial strategic breakthrough came from Malcolm late on a Thursday afternoon. While reviewing the board of directors' voting ledger, he uncovered a massive structural vulnerability in Julian's defenses. Over the past 12 months, Julian had quietly nominated and secured the appointment of 2 new, independent board members. These were highly respected industry veterans who possessed sterling reputations. Malcolm realized they were not actively participating in the corruption. Instead, they were preparing to vote in favor of the impending corporate restructuring based on a completely fabricated premise. Julian had convinced them that I, shattered by grief following my mother's funeral, had voluntarily and permanently surrendered my long-term voting authority to him. Malcolm immediately cross-referenced the digital timestamp of the supposedly notarized proxy transfer with my personal archives. The forensic evidence was devastating and beautifully conclusive. We compiled a bulletproof timeline utilizing my flight itineraries, high-resolution photographs from the charity summit in Santa Fe, and a dozen time-stamped emails sent from the event venue's wireless network. We possessed irrefutable proof that I was physically located 2 states away when the document was allegedly signed in downtown Austin. We had just elevated a messy internal dispute into an act of severe criminal document forgery that carried heavy federal penalties. Sitting in the secure hotel suite, Malcolm and I mapped out the sequence of destruction. We agreed that we would not launch a single preemptive strike. Releasing the evidence in fragmented pieces would allow Julian's highly paid legal team to isolate the damage, create counter-narratives, and manage the fallout over a protracted timeline. We needed a singular, overwhelming shockwave. We engineered a meticulously layered chain of evidence, designed to obliterate his credibility floor by floor. The sequence was set. First, we would expose the undeniable public violence to shatter the illusion of corporate professionalism. Second, we would reveal the illicit personal relationship and the resulting massive financial conflicts of interest, proving the theft of company funds. Third, we would drop the forged voting proxy documents to completely invalidate his executive authority and expose his illegal power grab to the board. Finally, the absolute kill shot. The fraudulent technical data regarding the thermal batteries, proving he was willing to risk a catastrophic public safety disaster to secure the government contract. My strategy was exquisitely simple and boundlessly ruthless. I was not going to fight him in the shadows. I was not going to send a discreet legal summons or orchestrate a quiet boardroom coup behind closed doors. I was going to let him dress in his finest tailored suit. I was going to let him step onto the brightest, most prestigious stage of his entire career. Surrounded by industry press, municipal leaders, and the employees he believed he owned, I would let him raise his hands in absolute triumph. And then, with the entire world watching, I would systematically dismantle his kingdom, his reputation, and his future, piece by piece, until there was absolutely nothing left but the truth. The execution was scheduled for Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours before the Sunridge Civic Transit Authority signing ceremony. The temporary contract worker known as Holly Reed officially ceased to exist. I submitted a standard 2-sentence resignation email to the external staffing agency, citing unforeseen personal circumstances, and I simply never returned from my afternoon break. My sudden absence from the fluorescent-lit basement was a calculated move. Julian, monitoring the operational floor from his glass tower, interpreted my disappearance exactly as I intended. He saw a woman who had finally absorbed the crushing reality of her defeat. He genuinely believed I had retreated to the safety of my luxury hotel suite to quietly lick my wounds and draft a list of financial demands for a discreet, uncontested divorce. He thought I prioritized my pristine social standing in Texas high society over the brutal, public exposure of a corporate bloodbath. His fatal flaw was projecting his own cowardly vanity onto me. While he was mentally celebrating his effortless victory, Malcolm and I transformed my suite into a militarized command center. We spent 48 straight hours assembling the ultimate execution device. It was not a metaphorical weapon. It was a physical, 6-inch thick leather binder. Inside those heavy covers, we sequenced the absolute destruction of my husband's life. We meticulously organized the high-definition security footage of the physical assault, the crystal-clear audio recording of his extortion attempt in our foyer, the unredacted engineering reports detailing the catastrophic thermal failure rates, the labyrinthine financial wire transfers to his mistress's family, and the damning forensic analysis of the forged proxy signature. But the most critical document sat at the very back. It was a fully drafted, legally binding emergency board resolution. It was written with ruthless precision, requiring only a majority vote to instantly strip Julian of all executive titles, freeze his equity, and physically lock him out of the corporate network the moment the gavel fell. With the weapon fully loaded, I needed to ensure the firing squad was standing in the correct position. I initiated a series of highly discreet, one-on-one meetings with the 3 remaining legacy board members. These were the stoic, battle-tested veterans who had helped my mother build the company from a dusty garage into a regional powerhouse. I met them in quiet, private dining rooms and secure airport lounges. I did not open the leather binder. I did not show them a single piece of evidence. I simply looked them in the eye and invoked the name of Elena Rodriguez. I told them that the foundation of the empire she built was actively cracking under the weight of an unprecedented internal threat. I stated that if they had any lingering loyalty to the woman who made them immensely wealthy, they would ensure they were seated in the front row of the headquarters auditorium on Tuesday morning. The sheer, terrifying gravity in my voice, coming from a woman who had famously avoided corporate politics for 2 years, guaranteed their attendance. Back at the headquarters, the absence of my counterattack acted like a powerful narcotic on Julian and Sloane. Their confidence metastasized into absolute, reckless arrogance. Julian began granting exclusive, embargoed interviews to premier financial magazines, positioning himself as the solitary genius ushering Aurelian grid systems into a new era of municipal dominance. He was already rehearsing his victory speech. Sloane, meanwhile, completely dropped the facade of an executive assistant. According to the terrified updates I received from my internal loyalists, she was actively terrorizing the logistics and public relations departments. She unilaterally changed the floral arrangements for the signing ceremony to her own preferred, incredibly expensive orchids. She dictated the seating chart for the press conference, ensuring she was placed directly beside the chief executive podium. She was barking orders at senior vice presidents regarding the catering menu and the lighting cues, striding through the executive level like a queen inspecting her newly conquered territory. She truly believed that by Friday, she would be selecting out the fabrics for the corner office redesign. But a true leader does not merely burn down a corrupt institution. She builds a net to catch it when it falls. I was intensely aware that amputating the chief executive officer and his entire support structure on live television would send the company's stock into a violent tailspin. I refused to let thousands of innocent employees lose their livelihoods just to satisfy my vengeance. Therefore, Malcolm and I drafted a comprehensive, minute-by-minute contingency protocol. I compiled a vetted list of untainted, highly competent senior directors who would be immediately elevated to acting executive roles the moment the board passed our emergency resolution. I finalized a robust, deeply reassuring internal memorandum that would be simultaneously blasted to every single employee inbox across the country. explaining the immediate transition of power and guaranteeing the absolute stability of their payroll and benefits. I even prepared a secondary, transparent negotiation framework for the Sunridge representatives, designed to salvage the transit contract by immediately opening our true, unredacted safety data to their municipal engineers. I was engineering a controlled demolition, ensuring the blast radius only vaporized the guilty. On the evening before the ceremony, I stood alone in the dressing room of my hotel suite, staring at the wardrobe I had selected for the following morning. If I were a lesser woman, acting purely on the venom of a betrayed spouse, I might have chosen something designed to aggressively flaunt my independence, something vibrant and overtly seductive to show him exactly what he was losing. Instead, I reached past the silk and the bright colors. I pulled out a severe, impeccably tailored suit in a deep, unforgiving shade of charcoal gray. It was cut with sharp, architectural lines. It was not armor designed to protect me. It was the exact uniform my mother wore when she walked into hostile boardrooms to force predatory competitors into submission. It commanded absolute, silent authority. I would wear my hair pulled back, my makeup minimal, my posture rigid. I was stepping back into the light not as a heartbroken wife, but as the apex predator of the corporate ecosystem she had inherited. Before I went to bed, I unlocked the heavy steel portable safe Malcolm had transported from the family trust vault. I bypassed the stacks of legal filings and reached into the very bottom corner. My fingers closed around a cold, heavy object. It was a solid brass key. It was the original master key to my mother's executive suite on the top floor. It had not been turned in a lock since the day she died. Julian had renovated the space, changed the digital access codes, and declared it his own. But he never realized that the physical manual override tumbler had never been removed. Holding that cold brass in my palm in the quiet darkness of the hotel room, I felt a profound, structural shift within my own chest. The grieving, passive daughter who had hidden from the immense pressure of the family legacy was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman who finally understood the brutal reality of power. Power is never politely inherited. It must be fiercely and actively defended, and when it is stolen, it must be taken back by absolute force. I sat on the edge of the immaculate hotel bed and looked out over the glittering, sprawling grid of Austin. I knew exactly what tomorrow would cost me. By noon, I would officially lose my marriage. I would lose the carefully constructed, pristine social image of the perfect Texas corporate couple. I would permanently destroy the last remaining, naive illusions I held about love, trust, and the fundamental decency of the man I had slept beside for 7 years. It was a terrifying, astronomical price to pay. But as I tightly gripped the brass key, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin, I knew the exchange was necessary. I was trading a comfortable, beautiful lie for the absolute, unvarnished truth. I was choosing the survival of my family's legacy over the comfort of a fraudulent life. Julian Mercer thought he had expertly outmaneuvered a ghost. Tomorrow, at 10 in the morning, under the brightest lights he could possibly assemble, he was going to learn what happens when the ghost decides to lock the doors and set the room on fire. At exactly 11 o'clock on the night before the Sunridge announcement, a sharp knock at my hotel suite door shattered the heavy silence. It was not room service. Standing in the hallway was a bonded legal courier holding a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy wax. He handed it to me, demanded a signature of receipt, and vanished down the corridor without a word. I locked the deadbolt, carried the heavy envelope to the glass coffee table, and sliced it open. Inside lay a preemptive, highly aggressive settlement offer drafted by Julian's private wealth attorney. The terms were staggering in their transparent desperation. He was offering an immediate cash transfer of $10 million, the unencumbered deed to our sprawling ski estate in Aspen, Colorado, and an ironclad, lifetime non-disclosure agreement. There was only one binding stipulation. I was strictly forbidden from stepping foot inside the Aurelian Grid Systems headquarters or communicating with any member of the board of directors for the next 48 hours. I let the heavy parchment drop onto the glass. I did not pick up a pen. I did not reach for my phone to call him. My absolute silence over the past 3 days had finally pushed him into the red zone of paranoia. A man who truly believes he holds all the leverage does not blindly offer a $10 million bribe in the middle of the night. He was no longer the arrogant king gazing down from his glass tower. He was a cornered animal, frantically trying to buy my silence using the very future he had intended to steal. He could sense the ice cracking beneath his feet, even if he could not yet see the dark water below. Less than an hour later, my encrypted burner phone vibrated against the mahogany nightstand. It was Denise. Her voice was thin, trembling with a volatile mixture of raw adrenaline and sheer outrage. She had just returned home from a mandatory late-night logistics staging meeting at the headquarters. As she was walking alone to her vehicle in the dimly lit underground parking garage, Sloane had stepped out from the shadows and cornered her between two concrete pillars. Sloane had completely dropped her polished, administrative mask, operating with the frantic, unchecked audacity of a woman who believed she was hours away from absolute untouchability. She issued a deeply poisonous ultimatum. She promised Denise an immediate promotion to the position of Executive Director of Human Resources, accompanied by a 40% increase in her base salary. In exchange, Denise had to sign a backdated, sworn incident report claiming that the temporary worker known as Holly Reed was violently unstable. Sloane demanded that Denise testify on the corporate record that I had initiated the physical altercation in the cafeteria and maliciously invaded the personal property of the chief executive officer. When Denise hesitated, Sloane coldly implied that anyone who failed to support the executive suite during the upcoming departmental restructuring would find themselves permanently blacklisted from the Texas energy sector. What Sloane failed to realize, blinded by her own venomous arrogance, was that Denise was an Aurelian veteran who survived on meticulous, bulletproof record-keeping. While Sloane was delivering her threats in the echoing garage, Denise had quietly slipped her hand into her coat pocket and activated the voice memo application on her smartphone. She transmitted the raw audio file directly to my secure server before she even started her car engine. We now possessed crystal clear, incontrovertible evidence of witness tampering, corporate bribery, and gross extortion, directly linking the chief executive's inner circle to a criminal cover-up. The mistress had just handed me the rope I would use to hang them both. The final fatal blow landed at 2 o'clock in the morning. A massive encrypted data packet arrived from Owen. He had spent the entire night bypassing the primary firewall of the suburban warehouse, digging directly into the archived communication logs of the lead engineering team. He found the smoking gun. It was a chain of internal emails sent directly from Julian's secure corporate account to the chief of product testing. The directives were explicit, completely devoid of any plausible deniability. Julian had issued a written, mandatory order to drastically alter the technical presentation slides destined for the Sunridge Procurement Committee. He explicitly commanded the engineering team to bury the thermal risk data and digitally erase the catastrophic failure rates affecting the core battery clusters. The email concluded with a chillingly casual reminder that securing the municipal contract was the single priority, regardless of the prototype variances. It was documented, premeditated fraud on a massive scale, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that my husband was actively constructing a lethal time bomb beneath thousands of city transit passengers. I forwarded the entire cache of emails to Malcolm, sitting in his own study across the city. My attorney spent the final hours of the night finalizing the lethal paperwork. He polished the draft of the emergency board resolution until the legal language was an impenetrable fortress. It contained 4 immediate directives: the absolute suspension of Julian from all executive and operational capacities, a mandatory, independent forensic audit of the entire Sunridge Transit contract, the immediate invalidation of all recent vendor approvals tied to his office, and the instantaneous, physical lockout of both Julian and Sloane from all Aurelian Grid Systems properties and digital networks the exact second the board cast their vote. I sat alone in the dark, the blue light of my laptop illuminating the silent hotel room. I did not review the evidence again. Instead, I carefully orchestrated the precise choreography of the execution. I mapped out the exact sequence of my strikes. I could not simply dump the evidence on the table and expect the board to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I had to guide them through the destruction step by step. I would begin with the undeniable truth that their entire workforce had already witnessed: the public violence and the shattered corporate culture. Once I had their horrified attention, I would strip away the disguise and reveal my true identity as the controlling shareholder. With my authority established, I would drop the forged proxy documents, proving a hostile, illegal takeover. And finally, before Julian could attempt to frame this as a bitter family drama spilling into the boardroom, I would detonate the thermal battery fraud. I would make it entirely clear that this was not about a broken marriage. It was about preventing a catastrophic federal crime that would destroy the company my mother built. Dawn broke over the city, casting long, pale shadows across the suite. I had not slept a single minute, yet I felt no exhaustion. My mind was a hyper-focused, frictionless machine. The cold knot of fear that had lived in my stomach for the past 2 years was entirely gone. I was not afraid of Julian's reaction. I was not afraid of the public scandal. My only burden was the heavy, solemn realization that in order to save Aurelian, I had to walk into the place that had once been my proudest heritage and publicly smash its current corrupted incarnation into 1,000 pieces. I had to expose the rot to the sunlight, knowing the stench would cling to my family name for years to come. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting the sharp cuffs of my charcoal suit. I picked up my leather briefcase, heavy with the weight of absolute truth. I walked out of the suite and stepped into the waiting elevator. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing me inside, the final remnants of the betrayed, weeping wife dissolved into the sterile air. I was Harper Rodriguez. I was the absolute controlling shareholder of Aurelian Grid Systems. The trial was over. The evidence was incontrovertible, and I was on my way to deliver the verdict. The grand auditorium of Aurelian Grid Systems was packed to its absolute capacity at 10 o'clock in the morning. The air practically hummed with the electric anticipation of a defining corporate triumph. Julian stood behind the sleek acrylic podium on the main stage, bathed in a wash of brilliant white spotlights. He wore his finest custom suit, flashing a perfectly measured, deeply confident smile at the flashing cameras of the industry press. He believed he was merely minutes away from locking his absolute grip on power through this monumental, multi-million-dollar agreement. Seated directly below him in the center of the front row was Sloane. She was dressed impeccably, her legs crossed, orchestrating the final logistical cues with the event staff like the undisputed future matriarch of the empire. Just as the lead representative from the Sunridge Civic Transit Authority reached into his breast pocket to retrieve his signature pen, the heavy double doors at the rear of the auditorium swung open. I walked straight down the center aisle. Malcolm Vale walked on my right, and Ruth Maddox walked on my left. The physical reaction of the room was a fascinating study in shock. For the executives and the press, there was only mild confusion at the interruption, but as I passed the rows of general seating, a violent, rippling wave of gasps erupted. Hundreds of operational employees, the very people who had spent the last week whispering about the disgraced temporary worker, recognized the woman in the severe charcoal suit. Holly Reed had returned. I did not march onto the stage screaming about a broken marriage. I stopped at the front of the aisle, locked eyes with the young information technology technician stationed at the audiovisual control board, and gave him a single, sharp nod. The massive digital screen behind Julian instantly blinked. The Sunridge logo vanished. In its place, towering 20 feet high, was the raw, high-definition security footage from the employee dining hall. The audio was patched directly into the auditorium's surround sound system. The entire room watched in horrified paralysis as Sloane slapped me across the face, the sharp crack echoing off the acoustic panels. Then came her shrill, unhinged scream, amplified for every single board member and reporter to hear. "That is my hubby's? You dare?" The auditorium plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence for the second time in a week, but this time, Nobody could look away. The undeniable reality of the executive suite toxic culture was broadcast on a massive scale. Before the shock could dissipate, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the matte black thermos. I held it up under the stage lights. The heavy steel gleamed. I unscrewed the cap, my movements calm and deliberate, and read the custom engraving inside the lid aloud. A private vow of loyalty, dated our first anniversary. Then, I turned my gaze from the thermos directly to the paralyzed crowd. I am not a disruptive temporary contract worker, I stated, my voice echoing clearly through my lapel microphone. My name is Harper Rodriguez. I am the controlling majority shareholder of Aurelian Grid Systems, and I am the legal wife of the man standing frozen at that podium. Julian gripped the edges of the acrylic stand, his knuckles turning pure white. His mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to project his voice. He forced a desperate, trembling laugh, attempting to address the Sunridge delegation. He stammered that this was a deeply regrettable, private marital dispute that had unfortunately spilled into a professional environment, promising it would be handled swiftly. This has absolutely nothing to do with my marriage, I countered, cutting him off completely. It has everything to do with corporate treason. Malcolm stepped forward, bypassing the podium entirely to address the two newly appointed, independent board members seated in the front row. He pulled the forensic proxy documents from his folder and projected them onto the massive screen. He systematically dismantled Julian's lie, presenting the forged electronic signature side by side with irrefutable proof of my physical location in New Mexico on the exact day of the supposed transfer. I watched the blood drain entirely from the faces of the two directors as they realized they had been manipulated into participating in a highly illegal, fraudulent takeover. But the third strike was the kill shot. I signaled the technician one final time. The screen shifted to display the independent forensic audit. Columns of red data flooded the display. I addressed the Sunridge delegates directly. I walked them through the labyrinth of newly formed shell companies registered to Sloane's family members, exposing the massive, irregular financial advancements draining our operational capital. Then, I displayed the altered technical logs. I presented the original, unredacted engineering reports, proving the catastrophic thermal failure rates of the battery modules we were about to sell them. I made it terrifyingly clear that Julian was deliberately burying lethal safety risks to secure their municipal funding, perfectly willing to let city buses burn to cover his own theft. Total chaos erupted. The press section exploded into a frenzy of camera flashes and shouted questions. The Sunridge representatives stood up abruptly, their faces tight with fury, pulling their legal counsel into a tight huddle. On the stage, Julian's polished armor completely disintegrated, trapped under the blinding lights and the crushing weight of federal fraud. His survival instinct kicked in. He pointed a shaking finger directly down at Sloane. He shouted over the din, frantically claiming that she had acted entirely alone, that she had manipulated the vendor accounts without his knowledge, and that she was a rogue assistant who had compromised the engineering data to protect her family's illicit contracts. It was the wrong move. Sloane was not a woman who would quietly take the fall. She sprang from her front row seat like a detonated explosive. She screamed back at him, her voice tearing through the auditorium, calling him a pathetic coward. She shrieked that every single forged signature, every erased safety protocol, and every stolen dollar was executed under his direct verbal orders. In her blind rage, she publicly referenced the exact deleted text messages regarding the data wipe, the very messages my team already had locked in a secure vault. They were publicly tearing each other to pieces, providing the final, verbal confessions required to seal their fates. Ruth Maddox stood up, her voice, carrying the heavy, undisputed authority of a founding director, sliced through the screaming. She officially called for an emergency, immediate vote of the board of directors right there in the front row. The vote was unanimous and instantaneous. Ruth delivered the verdict loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Julian Mercer was immediately stripped of all executive titles. He was permanently suspended from the board. All of his recent operational decisions were officially voided, and a special independent task force was authorized to review the entire chain of municipal contracts. Furthermore, both he and Sloane were instantly locked out of all corporate physical and digital systems. Security personnel, men who had previously been forced to bow to Sloane's every whim, flanked the podium. They did not gently guide them away. They sternly escorted a hyperventilating Julian and a fiercely sobbing Sloane off the stage and out of the side doors, marching them straight out of the building amidst the deafening, vindicated whispers of the employees they had treated like dirt. The heavy knot of tension in the room began to unravel, but the fate of the company still hung entirely in the balance. The Sunridge delegates were packing their briefcases. I stepped directly up to the abandoned acrylic podium. I did not offer excuses. I looked directly at the lead municipal representative and acknowledged the severe breach of trust. However, the Sunridge representative paused. He stated that while they would absolutely not sign the contract today, they recognized the immediate, transparent purge of the corruption. He agreed to maintain the intent of the partnership, provided Aurelian transitioned into a strict, temporary oversight mechanism under my direct supervision while the true safety data was independently verified. I looked out over the sea of faces, at the hundreds of employees who had feared for their jobs. I spoke not of vengeance, but of absolute responsibility. I publicly guaranteed that there would be zero retaliation against any employee who had witnessed or suffered under the previous toxic regime. I promised that this company would not be allowed to die simply because of the sins of a few greedy individuals. We were going to rebuild the grid, and we were going to do it with the integrity my mother had intended. When the applause finally broke out, tentative at first, but building into a roaring wave of genuine relief, I did not smile. I reached down and picked up the matte black thermos from where I had placed it on the stage. I unscrewed the lid one final time, raised the heavy steel rim to my lips, and took a long, slow sip of the cold water in front of the entire cheering auditorium. I lowered the thermos and placed it firmly down onto the center of the mahogany signing table, a silent, razor-sharp declaration echoing louder than any speech. From this exact second forward, absolutely no one would ever steal my name, my company, or my position ever again. Thank you so much for listening to this story to the very end, and please let me know down in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.